Great. Thank you, Melissa. And it's really lovely to be here on Zoom and great to see some cameras on and familiar faces too. So I'm Julian Grenier and I am Senior Content and Engagement Manager at Education Endowment Foundation. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Lauren.
Sorry, everybody. Lauren, I work with Julian at EEF, and I'm hoping very much that I am sharing my slides and that everybody can see them because you have now all disappeared. And I'm going to try and control these slides as we work through the session. And Julian is going to kick things off for us. So I will pop myself back on mute.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. And what would a webinar be without someone speaking on mute? It would be such a disappointment, wouldn't it? So we've called this webinar Using Research Evidence Well, and I'm going to immediately come clean and say that we think this is quite a tricky topic. And some of the content of this is quite challenging, and we've done it like that on purpose. And we're going to stop and temperature test and touch base as the session goes on. But we're also really interested in your views as the session goes on. So do pop any thoughts you have in the chat. We might not be able to respond in the here and now, but we might be able to pick them up at the end. And you know what? We're really interested to hear everything. So if you just want to put in the chat, like, I'm really not following this, or what on earth are you talking about? You know, it's fine, because all the feedback will really help us to learn from you. And that's one of the things Lauren and I want to do this evening, is to learn with you and to learn from you, as well as sharing some of the stuff we work on at EEF. So the session tonight is going to fall into three parts, thinking about what do we mean by this term evidence, examining evidence, and part three, which of course is so critically important, is using evidence well. So I'm just going to kick off here by just reminding us of this really salient but also troubling fact, which is that we've, for a long time, had a significant gap in outcomes between children from lower income backgrounds and other children. And that gap starts in the EYFS. Not only does it start in the EYFS, but it grows and grows as children go through our school system. So you can see here from the Education Policy Institute that the gap is estimated at about 4.5 months by the end of the EYFS. And you'll see that that's actually grown since 2019, the year before the COVID pandemic. And when you read across, you can see that that gap doubles to over 10 months by the end of Key Stage 2, 19 months by the end of Key Stage 4. And our mission at EEF is around breaking the link between family income and how well children do at school. And we see early years as a really important point to start to make the difference. And why is that? Why is for the straightforward reason that you can see that the gap starts early and it grows and grows. So if we can intervene early, that gives us a good chance of making a difference. And the second part of the EEF mission, alongside tackling that gap, is using research evidence. And that's going to be our focus this evening. As we go through the slides, wherever we've referenced some research, we've put a QR code on so that you can follow that up if you want to. So our work in the early years at EEF includes creating content to help practitioners access high quality research evidence. So you might have seen our early years evidence store or our toolkit or one of our guidance reports like Preparing for Literacy. We're also really busy testing and learning about programs that show promise. So for example, people connected with East London's Stronger Practice Hub, Brighter Start will know about Early Years Conversation Project. And we're doing a lot of work to see which approaches have positive impact. and also to learn about those that maybe looked promising originally, but when we actually try them out in the real world, don't deliver in the way that we'd hoped. I'm just going to take a few really top-level messages from this recent Leicester report, which I think is an important one. And I'd really urge people who've got time to have a look at the report direct, which is to make this big point that high-quality early years provision is important for all children. So every child who benefits a high-quality early years setting will benefit from that. It's positive for everyone. But for children from backgrounds where there's socioeconomic disadvantage, children from low-income backgrounds, the impact is particularly strong. Those children are particularly sensitive to quality. If the quality is high, they gain a disproportionate benefit, and that helps to close the gap. If the quality is low, they'll be disproportionately affected in a negative way and have a particularly poor start. So that quality is crucial for children from lower income backgrounds. And that is really the moral driving force behind what we'll be talking about this evening. So I'm going to hand over to Lauren now before Lauren falls off her chair and wonders why I've launched into this slide.
So I've seen a really interesting question in the chat, actually, and we are going to talk about sort of what quality evidence might look like and how you could potentially judge sort of the quality or the credibility of evidence. But before we do that, we had a bit of a broader question, and really happy to hear responses either by people unmuting or popping it in the chat. It's not a trick question because there are lots of different types of evidence, but we'd just like to know, when you hear evidence, what does that mean to you as an early years educator? It really isn't a trick question because there are lots of different types of evidence. If anybody fancies unmuting themselves, or maybe just popping something in the chat that I can read, it would be great to hear what you think. Okay, so something which has been checked or validated by somebody who's trained to be unbiased, something that's informed by data, something reliable, verifiable, valid. Ooh. Something that will make a difference to my children and families. I like my being in capitals there because that is really important. Data led from a wide sample, years of research. Okay. Great, thank you so much. So really interesting points here, and I think things that we'll sort of be speaking to throughout the session. And as I said, I really wasn't trying to trick anybody. There are different types of evidence. So research evidence is sort of the particular type of evidence that we'll be discussing in a bit more detail this evening. Yes, it is getting quite dark outside, and I think a lot of the comments that you guys have put in the chat make me think that this is probably what you were thinking about. So research evidence is something that's been sort of systematically generated, designed to answer a particular question, and it can often tell us about the impact of a particular practice or approach. You might also be generating some evidence in your own settings that's comprised of your sort of progress data, judgments of how well children are progressing across different areas of learning, and that might be a bit of a tapestry of things, examples of their work, conversations with parents and carers, information from health visitor, 2-year progress check. There's also then sort of the other category, which is a little bit broader, and there's lots of information out there concerning early years practice, which might not be generated through that systematic collection and analysis of data. And I can see that somebody has put a comment about evidence coming from a variety of sources. And as we can see here, this is kind of a variety of sources. So We are going to hear from Julian now about different types of research evidence, and then as we go through, we'll unpick a little bit more about how we might combine that with some of those other sources as well. So Julian, I'll pass back over to you.
Great, thanks, Lauren. I've just lost the slide there, Lauren. Is that me or is that other people?
We can still see the slides.
Okay. There's always this great opportunity, isn't there, to do some kind of tech disaster here. I don't know how I've done that, but never mind. I can manage that just about. So there are different types of research evidence, and really thoughtful comments have come through in the chat about, the fact that there are different types of research evidence, different people are going to have different perspectives on this. And that's an important point, I think, for us to bear in mind throughout this evening. So I'm just going to take you through some of the highlights from the EEF's Guide to Research Evidence, and you can follow the link up by following that QR code if you're interested in reading the document in full. Because like any webinar, what's going to happen here is that we're going to skim across the top in a useful way, but there is going to be much deeper reading and consideration that colleagues could give to this over more time. So we begin here by thinking about systematic reviews. A systematic review considers a whole range of previously published research studies on a particular topic. And it sets out the key steps which other people can follow. So those steps have to be consistent across all of the studies. So for example, there's a lot of research about feedback. And all of that research can be systematically combined and reviewed so that instead of having to read 120 research papers, we can look at the top level at what those studies are telling us. So the clear advantage of a systematic review is we're not just leaning on a single person's research. We're looking at something that has been researched in a high quality way by lots of people across lots of different contexts. So we can have some confidence that this is something that is going to be powerful and effective through a systematic review. There are some real downsides, though, when we study systematic reviews. One, which people who use the early years evidence store will know about if they've looked into the research summaries, is that very often we find that there isn't as much high quality evidence as we expected. So we end up putting something on the evidence store like there is little evidence to support this approach. Of course, we've got to be careful too, because one person's systematic review may not be as good as another's. So we need to be really sure that there's been a robust approach taken when the systematic review is done. And one of the things that EEF really prides itself in is the quality of its systematic reviews. So our contention would be that where EEF has done a systematic review, it will be very carefully and transparently done so that it's trustworthy. Next to that on the slide, you can see meta-analysis, and you can see the +1, +3, -1 graphic. And I'm just going to pause for a moment and just ask via the chat if anyone has come across meta-analysis and maybe where they've come across it. So have you seen that approach anywhere else? Okay, it's not a trick question. So if you're not familiar with it, it's fine just to put no, or we can just hold on a moment and see that we're not getting replies and move on. But I'm interested to know if anyone's kind of come across that before. Thanks, Elizabeth. It's really helpful just to get a bit of feedback. Yeah. Okay. So Michelle's put EEF there, and people who are regular users of the teaching and learning toolkit or the early years toolkit will have seen that kind of +1, +3, -1 type of approach. So you might have seen something like how communication and language strategies in early years have, off the top of my head, a +4 impact. They can make 4 months positive impact to children's learning and development. So that's what we get from a meta-analysis, which is where we combine all of the measurements from a range of research studies and give an overall or average impact. And that's really useful because sometimes an approach might have worked really well in one setting, but not quite so well in another. So that average can really help to guide us. But because it gives us that overall effect, it doesn't tell us some stuff that we might really need to know if we're putting an approach into action in our setting. So it might have that overall average effect, but there might be whole groups of children who don't benefit as much from the approach, or we might not know exactly what it is about the approach or the context it's done in that makes it more effective or less effective. So it's a really powerful way of understanding a lot of research, but it doesn't give us a final or definitive answer. It also raises some questions. I'm going to take the other one slightly more briefly here. We've got what we call experiments, or sometimes called randomized control trials, or RCTs. And in education, that will mean that we take one group of early years settings and we try out one approach, and we have another group of similar early years settings where we don't put that approach into action, and we compare the outcomes. And again, that can be a really powerful way of understanding how well something works, but it doesn't necessarily tell us which bit of the program worked, or if there was some contextual factors that made it work better in some of the settings than the others. What we call secondary data analysis, which sounds really complex, but I'm glad to say isn't, is where we take data collected by other people and we interpret it. So for example, earlier, I took data that's collected by the government for the EYFSP outcomes, and I made a claim about how children from less advantaged backgrounds don't do as well by the end of the EYFS as other children. And that's a useful thing to know, but underneath that headline, we don't really know anything. Like, why is that? What should we do? What are the factors that make this happen? So those sorts of secondary data analysis can tell us that something's important, but they can't tell us why this is happening or give us any insights. And finally, surveys and interviews where you're getting, also surveys and interviews where you're getting people's perspectives, opinions of pupils or parents or teachers, for example. So very frequently, you might see a program or an approach being advertised by a company that's trying to make some money out of you, and they'll say something like 90% of participants rated this training very good or excellent. And that's useful to know. You don't want to turn up at training that is rated poor, but actually just the opinion of people in the group that the training was excellent doesn't give us any insight into how high quality the content of that training was, or whether it's going to make a difference to the children. So we have to beware of surveys and interviews because they just reflect opinions which are important, but they don't give us any further depth. And finally, case studies, which one example of what was mentioned in the chat a moment ago about qualitative research. So in a case study, we might explore how a particular approach was put into action in an individual early years setting, what the educators did, what resources they used, what strategies they used, how the children responded to that. And this can give us a really rich picture of what's going on, and it can generate lots of reflections and lots of ideas. But there's one real risk if we take a case study as the main source of our evidence in order to make a change in our setting. And the risk of case studies is that it's about a specific context. It worked in that particular school, but we don't know if it will replicate. We don't know if it will apply in my context. We know something worked, where it worked, but we don't know anything else about it yet. So hopefully that's a useful overview of a lot of the jargon and technical stuff that gets kind of kicked around like a football. But the answer to the second question is an open one. Which is the most useful is really depends what you want, depends what you're wanting to find out as to which one will be most useful to you. And one of the things we really want to share with you this evening is a sense that we've got to think about the purpose of what we're doing and make the right choices, rather than someone can sit behind their webcam and just tell you the best approach to take. Over to Lauren.
I think you were going to tell us a little bit more about the evidence store process, Julian, but I am happy to speak to that if you'd like.
No, it's fine. I think I was just slightly tiring there of my own input around this and thinking, surely it's time for Lauren to come in. Yeah, so let me just tell you a little bit about the Early Years Evidence Store before we move on here. So the Early Years Evidence Store is, of course, the kind of flagship product that goes along with the Stronger Practice Hub program, co-constructed with the Stronger Practice Hubs. And I just want to tell you a little bit about how that has come about, thinking about that discussion that I've just led. So the Early Years Evidence Store is a really interesting and innovative product from the EEF. And why is that? Because it's taking information from two sources. So it's robust because it's based on synthesis. So just to recap, synthesis, where we take a wide range of high quality studies and we find out the important and shared aspects from all of those studies which worked, and summarize and synthesize those. And that's what the evidence store does in a really accessible way. But it isn't just coming from research synthesis. It's also coming from practice wisdom. So we've consulted with a wide range of practitioners to get a sense of the common and high quality practices which settings and childminders do every single day for the children they're with. And those practices are also reflected in the evidence store, which exists therefore as a guide to help us make the best decisions we can make about the sorts of ways that we make big differences for children, help their physical development, meet their emotional and social needs, support their developing communication. So it's an innovative bringing together of research evidence on the one hand, biosynthesis, and practice wisdom and experience on the other hand. Now I am going to hand over to Lauren.
So at the moment we have, for anybody who isn't familiar, I'll just do this very, very quickly before we move on. As Julian said, it's kind of a live co-constructed resource that we have developed, which currently includes 6 themes. So PSED, self-regulation, executive function, communication language, physical development, early maths and early literacy. And then we also have some guides that can help you to use the evidence store, which includes our guide to effective professional development. Also, a couple of new things that we've published recently for anybody who hasn't yet seen those. There is a guide to supporting children's mental health and wellbeing in the early years, which links back to the PSED and self-regulation themes. And also we have a completely new page, which is about improving the quality of early education through high quality interactions, through two sort of evidence-informed approaches, one of which is the development of those back and forth conversations with children, and the other is about the use of scaffolding. So we do have sort of a range of resources available, which have been developed using this sort of co-constructed approach between colleagues within EEF, contacts in the stronger practice hubs and beyond, and also some academics and experts. So we've tried to really sort of bring together these voices to shape the resource, and it is something that we will be reviewing and updating as the evidence landscape changes, because we also are sort of supporting evidence generation. So it's something to tap into and to keep your eyes on if you're not already familiar with it. So we're going to think about how we can examine evidence now, and there's been some really, really interesting comments coming through, so I'm quite excited. This is very, very tricky, but I'm excited to get into this. And I think Julian's going to start us off with this picture, which I had to look at it a couple of times to make sure I was understanding.
Okay. So I kind of hold up my hand to being a kind of research nerd by saying this is one of my favorite cartoons, but I'm not going to discuss the cartoon for a moment. I'm going to ask you to all hit the chat again. This is one I think that is hopefully helpful. So here's a headline from a newspaper. Depressed children treated with an energy drink improve significantly over a 3-month period. If you were professionally working with depressed children, what thoughts would go through your mind when you read that headline? Is that something you might do? Okay, so unethical. Tell us a bit more about that, Emma. You can unmute or you can put it in if you like. Put it in the chat if you like. So improves what? Okay, so the improve relates to their level of depression. So their mood improves significantly over a 3-month period if they're treated with an energy drink. What thoughts are going through your mind as someone who's working with this vulnerable group of children? Okay, is it a causal link? What measures? What happens after 3 months? How's it measured? And I think a particularly important point here, thank you, critically aware, having a bit of common sense. And yeah, also, like, are there some side effects? Okay. There's a question here about was it the attention they were getting that was impacting them? Sure, it wasn't the sugary drink. And Emma saying it's inappropriate. And there are many variables. And Charlotte saying there's random correlation. And what's happening here is we're tapping into the brilliant critical thinking, even cynicism sometimes of everyone who's on the webinar, and it's great to see that. I'm just going to talk you through another study, and it would be interesting again to get some reflections in the chat on this. And these are what are called prison awareness programs. Prison awareness programs aim to deter children and young people from crime by showing how difficult it is if you live in prison. Current or former prisoners meet children in school and show them what prison is like. So sometimes children visit a prison, sometimes prisoners visit children in their school or their community setting. And there's a range of approaches taken. So sometimes it's really an educational approach where the prisoner or ex-prisoner explains the situation. Sometimes it is a harsh approach in which the children are somewhat scared by imagining what life in prison would be like. So they might have to stand in a fake prison cell and be shouted at or feel otherwise vulnerable or afraid. And we know that if we follow up down the line, that rates of offending have reduced a year later compared to children who didn't take part in this program. So again, you're a secondary school teacher responsible perhaps for citizenship or PSHE. What are your thoughts about prison awareness programs and the fact that you're being told that rates of criminal offending have reduced a year after this program? So we've already got, I'm not sure how I'd feel about this as a parent, which I relate to very much, Emma. And we've still got some really useful comments coming through about energy drinks. Excellent question there is, was it funded by the drink company? And you'd be surprised how many studies are funded by the people who will make money out of the program at the end of the day. Okay, Emma says, who are the children? What were the variables? Were there other reasons that the rates of crime decreased? All of which are really good questions. So we're trying to do two things with this part of the webinar. The first one is to say, be a critical reader of research. You can't go on to social media or open a magazine for early years or schools without seeing lots of claims about research and things that are going to improve things for the children you're working with. We're faced with these things every single day. And what you're showing us here in the chat is that we can all just stop for a minute and just think critically and wonder whether these claims are all that they're cracked up to be. It's very, very easy. And this happens to me all of the time, and it happens to all of us all of the time, to get carried along by a kind of wave of positive emotion or discussion about an approach. We all find ourselves in that place, sometimes called the halo effect. You know, we really like that early years setting. We think the lead at the setting is really charismatic, and we're really impressed by someone's keynote at a conference. And therefore, we're very inclined to believe what they tell us. And what you're showing us in the chat is when we frame this question with, well, you know, is this likely to be true? Would you go along with this? Immediately, you're able to kind of kick in your critical reading skills. You're thinking, well, who are the kids? What were the other things involved? Who was sponsoring this? And all of those approaches that colleagues are taking are really powerful and important. But the thing is, tomorrow or the day after, all of us will hear something or open up something, and we'll be slightly carried along by the tide if we're not careful. So we need to always pause, think slowly, kick in with our critical reasoning. So all of the things that are said in the chat are really powerful and important. But the overarching answer to the question is about the fact that because things improve doesn't mean that it was the intervention that improved things. So, for example, if you have any group of depressed children, quite a few of them will have improved mood 3 months down the line. Because naturally, not everyone stays at the lowest point of their mood for a 3-month period. So in other words, if there'd been a control group who didn't get the energy group, you might have seen exactly the same improvement in that group of children too. The energy drink is a red herring. what's happening here is that over time, lots of people with a low mood will report a higher mood, and then it might regress again to a low mood a bit later down the line. But the energy drink is a complete red herring. So the drinking of the energy drink is correlated with that improved mood, but it doesn't cause the improved mood. It's just happening at the same time. Prison awareness programs. All of us who have or who've had teenage kids will be pleased to know that in general, as young people grow up, they're less likely to offend as they get older. Any group, that will be the trend that we'll see. So when people researched those prison awareness programs, they did see a reduction in offending and criminality. But what they didn't do was compare that to another group of young people who weren't involved in that program. And actually, if they'd looked at another group of young people who weren't involved in that program, they'd have seen something that would have been profoundly shocking to them, which is that those young people who received no intervention at all actually had increased reduction in criminality and offending. So not only did the prison awareness program not work, it actually had a negative impact. Now, this seems really simple to all of us sitting on this kind of webinar and thinking critically, but actually loads and loads and loads of secondary schools bought into those prison awareness programs because in ways that I completely understand, they were convinced that the program worked because they'd seen the data to show it, but there was no control group. So the reduction in criminality was merely correlated with being part of this program. It wasn't caused by the program. We sometimes see this as well with children's language development, which is that someone measures children's level of language and communication, hopefully using a robust measure. Then they do something in their setting to improve practice, and then they measure again and they see a really positive impact. But again, we've got to be really careful here because actually over a 12-month period, 3-year-olds' language and communication improves loads, whether you run a program or not. We also know that children at the beginning of their nursery year, for example, are less likely to feel confident, feel chatty and communicative, and therefore when we assess them, we might get an unexpectedly low score. And then as they spend a year with us, because of all the lovely, nurturing, supportive things we do, they become a lot more confident about talking with us. And therefore, when we reassess them, we see a much more positive picture. So you might well read a case study of how a setting changed their approach to supporting children's language. And there might be some really good assessment information to go along with that, showing the boost it's given to the children. But what you don't know is whether the children would have made that progress anyway. And that's where we've always got to be cautious. So quite a lot of kind of technical and researchy things to think about there. But these, I think, are essential cautions that we should always stop and ponder whilst we're hearing something that seems convincing and impressive and like something we want to do. And that research literacy, we think, is really important for all of us to have.
So to bring that all together, and I think in the spirit of questioning and being curious and being quite critical about what it is that we're being told, we have developed the CLAIMS acronym as a bit of a guide that you can use when you are examining a piece of research evidence. And this just offers some pertinent questions that you might want to ask in order to identify whether this piece of research evidence is something that you consider to be useful and credible in order to answer the particular question that you're asking. Because we might be asking questions about, well, what's a high quality piece of research? What's a good piece of research evidence? And in part, that depends on the question we're asking and why we're asking it. But also the credibility of that research evidence is really, really important, so that we can kind of judge whether this is something that we should be investing our time and energy in when we have so many other things that are often, you know, pulling on our time and our energy. So pertinent questions to ask include thinking about the conclusions. Really, we're looking for evidence that is clear, which underpins those conclusions. So if the evidence underpinning the conclusions is unclear, that's a bit of a red flag. Equally, if the discussion in the evidence is very one-sided, perhaps that discussion is one-sided in support of the researcher's view, that might also be a bit of a cause for concern, as opposed to having a bit of a balanced discussion that might highlight things like limitations, because different pieces of research evidence can be used for different purposes, and there are certain strengths with certain types, and there are limitations with what we can do and say using certain types of research evidence. So in an ideal world, those limitations will be spelled out for us quite clearly to enable us to understand the potential impact of those limitations on the findings and the outcomes and what we're seeing. Applicability is quite a big one. So I think the first thing I would be looking for is whether this particular thing can be replicated in a real life context. If it's something that has been conducted in a lab or a really tightly controlled setting, I would say that's unlikely to be something that's applicable for those of us working in earlier settings. But equally, we need to think about things like the outcome measures that have been used, which I think I saw somebody pointing out in the chat. So do those outcome measures relate to the things that we are trying to improve? And are the findings being applied to groups or situations that they weren't originally intended for? So are the findings saying, hey, this thing's really great for 3 and 4-year-olds, but actually they were being tested out on a group of 8 to 11-year-olds in the research? Independence is a big one. Somebody made a really good point about the energy drinks, and was it the energy drink company who had funded this research? So is there kind of a personal stake in the findings from either the researcher or the organisation? Is this something that's being promoted on a commercial website with somebody who stands to gain something from people sort of engaging with this particular intervention or particular approach? The methods, if we can't tell how the data has been collected, or if we can't tell how it's been analysed, that's going to make it very difficult to understand whether this particular research evidence is an appropriate thing for us to consider to answer the question that we might be asking. So we might want to understand how effective one thing is versus no thing. We might be looking to understand people's experiences of implementing a particular thing. So we might then look for something like surveys and interviews if we want to know about people's experiences. But if we're looking for something about maybe impact, we're potentially tending more towards a meta-analysis. And then the final thing is thinking about the sample population. So in an ideal world, we'll be able to see how many people were included in the study, what was the makeup of the group. If there were 2 different groups, were they balanced? So if there's a group of children who have received a particular intervention and a group who didn't, how similar were those groups? If they were quite similar, that's good, that's a green flag. If we haven't got that information, we might want to interpret those findings with a little bit more caution. There's quite a lot of big questions here, but I think that they relate really nicely to some of the questions and comments that came through in the chat when Julian was talking. And I thought it might be helpful to think about early years, bring it back to early years and think about a bit of an example. So If we had identified concerns about children's physical development, particularly sort of their moving and handling skills, so their object control and their gross motor skills, we might want to visit the Early Years Evidence Store. EEF is an independent organisation. None of this is paywalled. It's all freely available. We do not gain anything but joy from people accessing and benefiting from our resources. So if we're thinking about children's movement and handling skills, there is a particular approach on the Evidence Store which speaks to that. And within that approach, we have a range of video exemplification of what that might look like, which is something that we've captured across lots of different types of settings across the country. And we also have a web summary of the evidence. So the web summary of the evidence is telling us there's strong evidence here for this approach. It tells us that we can make a difference to children's physical development outcomes. If we spend time teaching children a specific skill, such as how to throw and catch or kick a ball, they can develop competence in that skill. And there is a lot more detail on the Evidence Store itself, of course, but there's some suggestions around ways that the research evidence suggests teaching might be more effective. For example, if we use both verbal and physical direction. However, since we want to be critical consumers of this evidence, we don't just want to take this for granted, this is all great. What we could do is have a look at our technical summary. And the technical summaries are available for every single approach in the Evidence Store. They are a downloadable thing that lives at the bottom of each approach page. And the technical summary gives a much more detailed explanation of the types of research evidence that we have synthesised and what each type of research evidence is telling us about particular outcomes, and how that has informed the web summary. And this particular technical summary is probably the longest one on the Evidence Store. It's about 6 pages because there is a really large body of research that sits behind this particular approach, and we include all of our references so that you can dig further into those if you want. So with the caveat that this is going to be kind of a very top level, I thought it would be helpful for us to think about some of the information that we've included in the technical summary using our claims acronym. So if I'm working in a preschool setting, say I'm working with 3 and 4-year-old children, I would be curious to know how old the children are that are in these studies. And I also want to know whether or not this source of evidence is going to answer my question around different practices and approaches that can be used to support children's moving and handling skills. So from the methodology here, we can see that we have synthesised 4 systematic reviews and an additional 36 primary studies. So it is a very large body of evidence for this particular approach. And most of the studies include children aged 3 to 6. We synthesise evidence internationally, and the definitions of sort of early years and preschool vary slightly up to the age of 7 sometimes. So the majority of these are with children aged 3 to 6. There is one study here that includes 2-year-olds, but the researchers found some difficulties with implementing things with those 2-year-olds. So we would recommend anybody working with 2-year-olds would need to think a bit more about their own context and how they would do that to support those children. And at EEF, we also think about socioeconomic disadvantage. So that's something that we always look for in our evidence base. And although some of the studies did include those children, it wasn't a focus of the reviews, so we were unable to draw any particular conclusions about how impactful or not this particular approach is for that group of children. To see whether this is applicable, we have information about the setting type. So these studies were conducted in early years settings, outdoor spaces and halls as well. And we can see highlighted in bold there that there are 2 of the outcomes that we were particularly interested in, which was children's gross motor skills and their object control. So far, so good. We're giving a very balanced conclusion here. So the overall evidence picture is positive, and there is a large body of evidence, but there is variation here. So between the systematic reviews and the primary studies, there is variation in whether or not there was a positive effect on all of the outcomes, some of the outcomes that were being measured, and also for those that did have a positive effect, there is variation in how effective those particular interventions were. So we're trying to present a very balanced picture. We're not saying, yes, this is all absolutely amazing, you should all be doing all of this all of the time. We're saying there is absolutely positive evidence to support these things, but it's not an overall kind of positive picture that we could expect every single outcome would be improved by doing these particular things. We include a note of caution. As Julian mentioned earlier on, there are some limitations with things like systematic reviews. There can be issues with the quality of primary studies sometimes, and the evidence landscape in early years is still really kind of developing here. So the authors have kind of flagged that there might be a bit of a risk of bias in some of those primary studies. However, we consider that based on the size of the evidence base and the fact that the evidence base is really cohesive, as in the evidence base is all kind of pointing in the similar direction, that we can still kind of consider that to be a reliable indicator of what the bigger picture here actually is. And finally, in terms of limitations, there are still large gaps in the evidence base, and I think we can say that in most areas of evidence synthesis for early years currently. Evidence often doesn't do a great job of specifically describing the role of the adult. It doesn't often give us a really detailed kind of explanation of the content that's been taught, perhaps, and the components of particular, the components that make up interventions, which would enable us to kind of make comparisons between different types of interventions to spot which things might be more or less helpful, and also which of those things in a particular context might make it something influential. So overall here, there is a really sort of positive picture, and hopefully you can see from the things I've picked out that we are trying to provide people with as much information as we possibly can to assure them that the evidence we have synthesized is as credible and as robust as it can possibly be, so that this is something that you can kind of use with confidence within your own practice. Julian, did you want to come in on that? No. So I'll pause for 1 second before we move on. I'm really conscious of time, but I was just wondering if anyone had any comments or questions about that before we move on to our last section. I'm hoping it's stunned silence. Okay. I'll try and keep an eye on that, but I will move on because I'm conscious of the time. So
Thanks, Lauren.
This final section is about how we can use research evidence, and I think I'll very quickly go through this so that Julian can kind of get into the bigger picture here, because I think that we touched on some of this earlier. Research evidence is one piece of the puzzle, and we would really strongly recommend that you try to build a rich research picture, and often that might involve using multiple sources, as well as your own expertise as early years professionals, leaders, practitioners, your expertise with regards to your setting, your children, your staff teams, your routines, your resources. Your professional expertise can help you to sense check what research evidence is telling you. And in order to use that research evidence well, we need to think really carefully about implementation, because implementation is the thing that helps us to move our engagement with research evidence into tangible practice change and then into outcomes for children, hopefully improving over time. So Julian is going to take us through the last part of the session to think about that implementation piece.
Great, thank you, Lauren. So I'm going to cover these two slides fairly quickly so that we've got that time for Q&A at the end, which I think is really important. This is from a School's Guide to Implementation, which is a really helpful document from EEF that draws on lots of research evidence around making positive changes in schools. And there's a very big message in there, which we think is applicable to schools and early years settings and anyone who's driving this process, which is to think about implementation as a process, not an event. So we've all done that thing where we went to a conference, we heard something really inspiring, we came back, we told everyone at a staff meeting, and then we wanted that to happen in our setting. But it never works. Implementation requires really careful planning, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of thought. It's a process, and it's not an event. And the second thing I'd say about it is to really think about the social nature of making change. All of us are inclined to be resistant to most of the changes that various higher up people in our lives try to make us do. That's human nature. And it's good to have that questioning frame of mind when change is in the air. And what that means is that if we're responsible for implementing a change in our setting, we must think about the social dimension. So if I just move on to the final slide here, here are some of the things that we think it's important to focus on. Be realistic. What's our capacity? You know, I might be somewhere and I want to make 25, 50 changes to what's going on. But actually, if I know that each change is going to take a lot of time and thinking through and need a lot of social support, then perhaps I'd be better to narrow that down to one or two key things to change. The second question is always feasibility. Can we do this here? Isn't it great to hear that Setting Up the Road has implemented this fantastic approach? But before we get carried away, let's just think about whether we actually can do it in our own setting, in our own school. Acceptability is really important. Will our colleagues be positive about making this change? Now, I'm not saying rule it out because you're worried they won't be positive, but ask yourself the question, is there going to be that positivity? Do people see the reason for it? Are they going to want to do it? If they're not, how am I going to convince them that this is something important to do? Next bullet point, very close to my heart, the so-called pre-mortem. So we're all used to sitting around after the event and, you know, wisdom and hindsight are wonderful things. And it was obvious it was all going to go wrong, wasn't it? But why not do that before you even start? We're thinking of introducing this new approach to children's physical development. What are all of the things that might go wrong? Let's just spend 15 minutes brainstorming. And because that can help us get a quick insight into some of the issues around feasibility and acceptability and realism, for example. I've already focused on being careful and thoughtful. Active ingredients is a really important thing to consider. So if you're taking on a program that's been designed by someone else, like Maths Champions, for example, which is a really well-evidenced program, think through in detail about what's absolutely essential in this program and the things that you can adapt to suit your context when you're thinking about the actual children, the actual adults, the actual community that you're working with. And in the Maths Champion program, there is an explicit process working with the mentor to think about how you're going to make this work in your own setting. Same with early years conversation project. Leadership is really important. Checking that the change is happening, encouraging people, troubleshooting, we can solve this, we can do it. Let's just look at what the problem is. We can get through this. Time for discussion. And taking all of that together, just to go back to our key question, why use research evidence? And I'm going to suggest 3 big reasons. Number 1, our time, effort, energy are all limited. They're all limited resources. And research evidence helps us to make the best choices. We can't guarantee things will work, but we can say that where things have been tried, tested, and done in multiple locations and worked, they're good bets for us. Number 2, we've got a moral imperative to do what we can to close that gap between children from lower income backgrounds and the rest. And selecting those best bets that have been thoroughly evaluated gives us the best opportunity to put that high quality practice into action, which we know is going to be good for all of our children, but it's going to be especially good for children from lower income backgrounds. And number 3, why use research evidence? Because the other steers we get are inherently more risky. Some of us, including me, will put our hands up to the era of learning styles and thinking about visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learners and having to plan everything 3 ways to meet each learning style. And it was a long time before our sector was made fully aware that there was absolutely no evidence behind this theory that children have different learning styles. So it hugely wasted everyone's time and energy. But it also meant we didn't thoughtfully look at the things we were doing and use our time well. We wasted our time and it held our professional development back. And again, some people on the call might remember Brain Gym, that brilliantly marketed snake oil that thousands of schools adopted at the height of its success. Again, no evidence behind it at all. Gobbled up loads of money and loads of time that could have been spent on high quality professional development and improving the quality of what we offered children. So that's why we think you should be thoughtful, critical, but also optimistic users of research evidence. Massive thanks to everyone who's participated so well in the chat. And we've got some time now for the Q&A.
Well, while people are gathering their thoughts and thinking of the questions that, as my brain is whirring after that, I just want to say thank you so much, both of you. That was amazing because it's such a complex thing to try and squish into that time. And it was just brilliant. And the way that you then related it to the evidence store, I think is so helpful because we're using that such a lot. And to be able to see the work that's gone into the evidence store, for people to really understand what's behind that, I think is really important. So thanks both so much.
So again, whilst people are gathering thought, there's this really useful comment from Elizabeth in the chat where she says common sense comes into this, and amen to that. We've got a lot of professional experience and expertise of working with children and working with our communities. And I always, though, remember a really useful thing Kathy Nutbran, who's Professor of Education at Sheffield University, said to me when I was a young teacher working with her in Sheffield, which was, problem with common sense, Julian, it isn't as common as you think it is. And it seems obvious often from our vantage point that something wasn't going to work or that people lost sight of a common sense response. But it's harder than we all imagine it to be. And common sense isn't always as common as we'd like it to be, too, although I fully agree with the point that it must come into this. Okay, we've got a question about sharing the video. Is that this is going to be recorded and shared with participants? Am I right, Melissa?
Yeah, that's right. It's being recorded and we'll be able to share it. So yeah.
Thanks, Lauren. I wondered if you liked the. I'm often too quick to balance enthusiasm up there. Balance enthusiasm with a sprinkle of realism.
I mean, I think they're both important factors, to be honest. We all work really hard, don't we? And it's great to kind of have a positive attitude and bring some enthusiasm, but the realism can ground us as well and make sure that we're kind of looking at the bigger picture. There's a really interesting question here about how we see EEF's early years work developing. Julian, I thought if I maybe quickly say something about the exchange and then you could talk a bit about the bigger picture.
Sure.
So the QR code that's currently on the screen is a sign up for what we're calling the EF exchange. Basically, we're looking for people from all phases. Obviously, we are particularly interested in hearing from colleagues in early years. We do we're planning a range of activities essentially where we're really hoping that we would be able to gain your insight and your expertise. So planning some user testing around the evidence store and sort of how that's working for people, what you like about it, what you don't. So by signing up for the EF exchange, that just kind of puts you in touch with us essentially, because we're really keen that everything that we make is what you want and it's useful. Obviously, we're doing kind of the credible, robust research evidence part, but we really want a broad range of voices and experiences from the sector to shape what we do moving forwards. So the EF exchange is a great way to get involved with offering your ideas and perspectives.
And there's a question there about international schools and EEF exchange, and I think I'm right in saying that this is for schools based in England only, Lauren. So sorry about that, Jenna, that the nature of our endowment is we're focused on schools in England. Liz, that is a great question about how we see EEF's early years work developing. And I'm going to just take a slightly left field way of responding to that, which is that we're really interested to learn from people on the call about how you see the EEF's work developing and us being as useful as we can to the sector. And what Lauren's just said about the exchange is a real thing. We want you to get your phone out now, scan that QR code, get involved in EEF exchange and help co-construct and shape our approach. We really want and need and will benefit from you doing that. So please do it. But I don't want to just be sort of smart about it and not answer the question. So the question is, we see our work increasing. We're ambitious to make the biggest possible difference we can in children's early years, working with the sector, getting more people from the sector to join with us, to help us put our resources together to make them as accessible as possible, and to advocate for the use of research evidence as practitioners speaking to other practitioners. And that's a kind of rough sense of where we want to go. If we want an education system where children's background isn't a barrier to achievement, we have to do better in early years. We have to. And that is no kind of negative comment on the incredibly hard work that everyone is doing, which is genuinely, and I'm not saying this lightly, heroic in the face of the difficulties that are faced, the difficulties on the ground. It's incredible what Team Early Years is achieving. But what we hope is, with higher quality professional development, insight into research evidence, co-construction with the sector, more evidence advocates who are based in early years settings, schools, childminders, we can make that difference. We can improve the quality of early education, we can improve equity in our system.